of evolution is this guy up here, Darwin. Believe it or not, I mean, this is a typical picture of Darwin. You've probably seen little cartoons and stuff with a beard, but I've also seen typical pictures of Darwin looking like this. And it's the same person, believe it or not. So Darwin is the author of a book back in 1859, The Origins of Species, where he went to the Galapagos Islands and he looked at certain kinds of finches, which is a type of bird over there. There's 14 different species there. He made a couple points when he observed all this stuff. There's something called the descent of modification, where all the species of finches came from one. So somehow that one mother finch, over the centuries and eons, changed, the beaks have changed and so forth. It all came from one. He also came up with this theory called natural selection, where your body or your certain species has adapted to certain things. Certain beaks on these birds, maybe they had to have a very pointy beak because that's where the good worms are in a tree. So they have to get a very pointy beak to do that. But they had other finches that had beaks that were curved, and they weren't so good to go into those, to get those worms or whatever animals that are in the trees. So because of that, the birds with the curved beaks will probably die off because they can't get the worms that the birds with the pointy beaks could. So we call that natural selection. Their bodies have adapted with these pointy beaks. Okay? So we have this thing that we call evolution. All right? It's a process of change that has transferred life on Earth. But you will never, ever, ever, ever see evolution happen in your lifetime. This happens over not even centuries. We're talking about thousands and thousands of years. You know, our bodies have changed from what it was when we were a caveman. And believe it or not, our bodies will change, adapt to whatever new things are happening on the earth or whatever we're changing to. I believe that our eyes will probably be much, much bigger, let's say 5,000 years from now, than what they are now. Because it looks like these smartphones are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and our eyes have to soon adapt to that small things, so our eyes will get bigger and bigger and bigger. All right? So that's why you will never see it in your lifetime, but things do change. It occurs over centuries, millenniums, and so forth. So the easiest way we could explain give you an example of a natural selection is the good old, the largest, or not largest, but the tallest animal we have on Earth, the giraffes. Giraffes, some of them, when we're talking about eons ago, some of them had short necks, some of them had long necks. But the giraffes that had short necks would be able to eat the low-lying cherries or leaves that are down here. But they're going to be competing with all the horses and zebras that are about the same tallness. So the ones that had the longer necks were able to reach up here to get those leaves that they wouldn't have to compete with all the other animals. So lo and behold, after eons and eons of times, these giraffes over here died off because they competed with too many other animals. These were the ones that were able to survive because they're not competing with other animals to get those leaves. Natural selection. Again, it doesn't happen in your lifetime. It happens in thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Okay? So you can understand this comical cartoon a little bit, right? Great moments in evolution. These baseball players here, somehow they got to get that ball, right? Okay. Questions so far? Pretty straightforward, right? Okay. All right, so let's talk about scientific method. All right? science, who decides what constitutes knowledge? Is there any difference between fact, or law, and hypothesis? What does it mean to systemically ask and answer questions? Is there an organization that you should be asking to make sure you cover everything? Can you generate explanations from natural phenomena that are consistent with current knowledge? The sun is going to shine tomorrow. It's going to rise because that's what's happened for the past eons. But there's a reason for that. You need to constantly revisit explanations to accommodate new knowledge. You need to go back to certain things. Is Pluto a planet or not? That changed things, right? So the scientific method is an organized description of the steps to make sense of something, all right? Helps us to develop a logical explanation of why something is happening. Utilizes both inductive and deductive reasoning. Rule out and rule in certain things. All right, so this is what we got to do. We've got to think about this. We observe. You identify a problem by your observation. And you record your observations by collecting data. For example, you see your dog scratching. You're observing that. The dog is scratching. So, your dog, Prince, we'll call him, is scratching himself. You're identifying a problem and you want to try to explain why he's scratching himself. Once you can explain this, you can brainstorm how to fix it. Well, let's use the scientific method to see if you can logically put this all together. Explain why Prince is scratching himself. Okay, so first step, you observe a problem. You want to try and do something. So you form a hypothesis, some kind of a tentative answer to a well-framed question. By using some previously explained knowledge, you form a question. You wonder if Prince has some type of infection or if something is eating or biting him. Maybe that's why he's scratching himself. You consult your pet manual and you form a hypothesis that he may have fleas. Okay, so you're picking up other information. Fleas. I never heard about fleas, but they seem to be biting and that causes scratching. Okay, maybe Prince has fleas. So we've got to go to step 3 now. We form an hypothesis. If he has fleas, he's scratching. Okay. So now you got to develop a prediction. And it should follow a logical reasoning from this hypothesis that you came up. You read some more about the subject and the consequences of fleas living on Prince. You try to put your thoughts into a logical format here. If it is true that Prince has fleas, then what would be logically to follow? Would treatments designed to kill or repel fleas bring relief for Prince? Right? Coming up with a prediction. Now you got to test the prediction. A hypothesis has to be testable. So you execute a number of experiments. You might try giving Prince a control bath. Control this bath. Well, you're just going to be washing him with soap and water. Nothing else. If that makes his itch go away, and you didn't put any kind of itching shampoo in there, you just did soap and water, if the itch goes away, then he's probably just dirty. He didn't have fleas. You should also do some research to determine if fleas drown in normal bath, right? If he still scratches constantly after his bath, you can try flea shampoo or a flea collar. If one of these works, then you might decide your hypothesis was the correct explanation of Prince's discomfort. Okay? I know this takes longer than, you probably could figure this all out on yourself, but we're going step by step so you understand what the scientific method is all about. I'd rather use an example that's easy that all of you can follow. So now you've got to be able to repeat your test. A test has to be repeatable. So it has to be retested and retested. It should be reliable. Is your explanation reliable? If you do it again, you should get the same results. Can you make a generalization? Repeat the test next time when Prince starts scratching in the same way. Ideally, you would ask someone else to repeat your test. Maybe you're putting the shampoo on a different way because you see where he scratches, you're going to spend more time putting more on there. You're biased. It'd be better to have someone else put the soap on so they're not as biased. If Prince brings Princess home for a visit one day, okay, and you notice that she is also scratching, you might give her master, her owner, the same flea shampoo and see if it works. If Princess gets relief from her flea shampoo bath, you may be on the way of making a general statement about the dog's scratching reason. So you've got to record all your results, the scientist would. You make a conclusion and document your successful and also unsuccessful experiments. It's okay to be unsuccessful. Just going back to the drawing board, but it's okay because it didn't work out. It makes you want to see, well, we've got to remove something, we've got to do the test a little bit different. You share your results with others and they'll add their results to yours. We'll be doing that in the lab room over here. Putting other people's labs, when we put them all, you'll do certain things and you'll see, maybe for some reason you didn't wear gloves and you contaminated something. And that's okay. I'm not saying anything wrong with that. You know where you went wrong. And that's the important thing. But maybe the other group did it correctly. And we'll compare different things. You may have enough data to conclude that fleas are a reasonable explanation for the scratching problem and the active ingredients in the flea shampoo were the likely solution. So the summary steps, you identify a problem by observing, you make a hypothesis, an educated guess of what would happen, you make a prediction, you need to test and retest that prediction, repeat the experiment, and then make some sort of conclusion. Okay? Questions on that, right? Good example? Everybody can relate to, right? Okay. Now, hypothesis versus theory versus law. They don't mean the same thing. A theory and a hypothesis is not the same thing. Law is not the same thing. They're just three different animals, really. A hypothesis is a reasonable guess of what you observe. But you're observing a particular thing, not a general thing. For instance, when you looked at Prince, you're looking at one particular thing. Is it fleas that's doing this? That's causing him to scratch? Right? You're not looking at the whole thing on all the animals and stuff, because it's different. You're looking at more specific. So an example is that female birds prefer to mate with male birds that have longer tails. It's very specific. That's a hypothesis. A theory is when more than one hypothesis have been retested and proven. It may partially be true if later on more discoveries have happened. and then you build on it. I mean, Newton back in, I don't know what century, it was the 16th century, an apple falls on his head and says, oh, gravity did that. Or not gravity, but things will just fall. He came up with that idea. And that theory that if you let something go, it will go down to the ground. But we built on that. We learned about gravity. We learned about things that are being attracted to something. We built on that. So it may be partially true, but we learn more about it from other people's experiments or observations. Theories deal with a bigger, more generalized issue than what a hypothesis does. For instance, modern organisms descended from pre-existing life forms. A more generalized thing. Does that make sense? We didn't look at one particular thing, like the birds, how they mate and stuff. We looked at a generalized thing. Then we have something that's a law or a fact. This is usually short and straight to the point. Law of gravity. Boom. You know what I'm saying? It's just things will fall, will continue to fall. It's universally and mathematically being always true and can never be disproven. Example, living things are made up of cells. We know they're made up of cells. There's no question about that. See the difference here? So let's just do another example so you understand the three things. Let's use evolution as an example here. Evolution happens. It's a law. It's a fact. Evolution has happened. Okay? It's the law of nature. However, it does not describe the how and why it occurred. Okay? Describing the how and why it happened, this would be a theory. A good example is what we talked about before. Natural selection is a theory. It provides a host of descriptions for various mechanisms, describes the method by which evolution works. Okay? Describing one particular observation, that's a hypothesis. If seals stay away from polar bears, they will avoid being eaten. More specific, part of the natural selection, but it's more specific. Does that make sense? Okay? Questions about these three terms. You should know the difference between these three. Okay, some further thoughts. Inductive reasoning. Make generalizations based on observations about the world. Make logical explanations from the specific to the general. An example of this would be an observation. Every winter in the past was colder than the preceding summer. Generalization. Winter will always be colder than summer. Does that make sense? Right? Right? Then we also have deductive reasoning. Use general premises to make specific predictions. If organisms are made of cells, premise number one, and humans are organisms, premise number two, then humans are composed of cells. Deductive reasoning. Make sense? Okay. Some other things. Variables. We'll use the word variables. They're factors. Factors that vary in an experiment. They vary. They're factors that we can, temperature, pressure, we can change those variables. All right? A controlled experiment is an experiment that cancels out effects of certain factors by using what we call controlled groups. Two groups are always used, but one of those groups, we're not adding something to it. For instance, we did the Prince thing, right? We did the dog. A controlled group is that we're going to wash Prince, the dog, with just soap and water. We're not adding the ingredient. So one group is not being treated with a certain factor. It's left alone. So we're taking Prince, we're washing with just soap and water. That's the control. Then we can take Prince another time and do soap and water with the flea shampoo. So you've got to have a control group. If he doesn't scratch with the control group and he isn't scratched with fleas or with the flea shampoo, the control group, that proves that it's probably not the fleas, unless they get drowned, right? Independent variable, a factor that affects the experiment. Okay, something you're doing to the experiment. In a perfect example, there should only be one independent variable. Kind of difficult to do, and I'll explain why. A dependent variable is how it responds. It has to be measured. But it's what the independent variable does. So an independent variable is what I change, what I can do to the experiment. A dependent variable is what I see happens, the results. So this is the best way I can explain it. You take water and you're going to pour it on the grass. The water itself, the sprinkling of water on the grass, I have control. It's independent. No one's telling me what to do. I'm controlling that. And I'm sprinkling on the grass. The grass is going to grow, or hopefully. It's dependent on the amount of water that I'm giving it. And I can measure the length of the grass. Does that make sense? So understand the difference between a dependent variable, depends, I hate using the word in the definition, but it depends or relies on the independent variable, what you do to the experiment. What I'm doing to the experiment is independent. I'm doing that. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? A lot of confusion when they get independent and dependent variables in students. Okay. So just understanding cause and effect. The cause is putting water onto the grass, that's the independent variable. The effect of the grass growing or not growing is the dependent variable. Okay, and the last thing I just want to talk about, scientific method is not perfect. So we have some issues with it, and these are just some that you should be able to understand. First off, it's been invented, that scientific method is invented by historians and philosophers, not scientists. We've got to think it's been based off of philosophy, all right, not the people doing the experiments. It infers that it must follow specific order, not necessarily. Okay? The test might have been an observation already, and it went out of order. It infers there is only one method, the scientific method. No, there's other methods that you could have done. I'm sure you had a dog that had the same thing, that was scratching, and you didn't use the scientific method. You used some other method that your brain created. The discovery of science, or discovery science, has more important contributions with very little dependence on the so-called scientific method. In other words, we discovered so many different things without even doing the scientific method. Even before the scientific method came out, we weren't even doing it. The bottom line that I want to just say, do an experiment by way of the scientific method is good. But just know that there's other ways that work, or just as good, or even better. But you should know the scientific method, because it's a very rational way of doing something to make sure that you cover it. Okay?